Bene, scusate l'attesa. Buonasera, benvenute e benvenuti a tutti a questo uno dei 3 eventi paralleli di chiusura dell'edizione 2025 di Biennale Democrazia. Questa sera ospitiamo Vincent Bevins, che è un giornalista, un autore, uno scrittore, che è stato corrispondente del Washington Post e durante quel periodo ha scritto un libro molto noto che molti di voi conosceranno, che si intitola Il metodo Giacarta. Poi è stato corrispondente del Los Angeles Times per il Brasile e ora lavora per la London Review of Books. E il libro che discutiamo questa sera, che Vincent ci presenterà, è questo, titolato Se noi bruciamo, il cui sottotitolo dice già molto. Io non voglio fare spoiler, infatti non dirò pochissimo perché è facilissimo spoilerare questo libro, perché è un libro anche parsimonioso, che ha una tesi molto molto precisa. 10 anni di rivolte senza rivoluzione. È un libro molto documentato, questo posso dirlo senza fare spoiler. C'è un libro che si basa su 200 interviste ad attivisti, a partecipanti, ai movimenti sociali che dal 2010 al 2020 hanno scosso il mondo. Ma poi il mondo è andato in una direzione diversa da quella auspicata da questi movimenti. Questa è la domanda. C'è una domanda centrale che è questa. Il mondo è stato attraversato da movimenti di massa importanti, ma poi la direzione del cambiamento politico e sociale non è stata quella che questi stessi movimenti avevano sostenuto. Insomma. Il libro è un libro molto leggibile, con un paio di capitoli analitici con riferimenti importanti alla letteratura specialistica, cioè alla letteratura accademica, e poi dei casi, no? Ci sono un certo numero di paesi, un certo numero di medaglioni che Vincent ricostruisce e per ognuno di questi trova, diciamo, delle regolarità che si ripetono, e poi la sua risposta va in quella direzione, ve la dirà lui. Il libro è stato tradotto già in 5 lingue, ci sono altre traduzioni in arrivo. Allora, Vincent ci parlerà 30-40 minuti e poi ci lasciamo 10-15 minuti alla fine per eventuali domande e approfondimenti. Grazie ancora e la parola a Vincent Bevins. Grazie.
Yes, thank you very much, Filippo. Thank you to everyone who has come today, and thank you for the invitation to speak here in Torino. I'm truly honored to be able to speak about this work here, and truly pleased at the amount of reception that this book has gotten in different parts of the world. I've been happy to see that it's been read in different ways in different parts of the world, which is something that an author always likes to see. As Filippo said, I'm going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. I will try to speak slowly and clearly because we have simultaneous translation. I know that Italian is often more verbose than English. So I will do my best to hit that amount of time, but also remain clear. So I will be, of course, presenting this book, explaining what it is, where it comes from, and what it tries to do. This book is a history of mass protests in the 2010s. But first, I would like to go a little bit into the past and discuss some historical context. So in 1989, Giovanni Arrighi and Emanuel Wallerstein, 2 theorists working in the world systems tradition, published a set of essays on anti-systemic movements, the forms that resistance has taken in human societies in the era of the capitalist world system to transform, improve, work against that system. And Wallerstein does something that I think is quite interesting in this moment. This is just months before the Soviet Union collapses. And he divides anti-systemic movements into 6 broad categories, that correspond to different forms in the first, second, and third world before and after the watershed moment of 1968, which most people agree somehow changed the ways that resistance and protest are carried out. So the historical form corresponding to the first world before 1968 is the trade union movement and the closely associated Social Democratic Party. The form associated with the second world before 1968 is obviously the Leninist Party. The form associated with the third world before 1968 is the National Liberation Movement. Then after 1968 in the first world, he discusses what he calls the new social movements. Now, young people, often students who were responding to the perceived bureaucracy of the trade union movement or the Marxist-Leninist Party, developed new ways of resisting the capitalist global system. In the second world, in the post-1968 era, he talks about bureaucratic revolts within the party in Moscow and the rest of the Soviet Union and the Allied States to try to transform that system. And then in the third world, after 1968, he talks about religious movements, whether liberation theology in the Catholic world or Islamism in the Muslim world. Now, every case that I analyze in this book, all of the mass revolts that I end up looking at closely from 2010 to 2020 can trace their organizational and ideological roots to the first world after 1968. At the same time, all of the revolts in this book take place in the former second or former third world. And that, I think, is relevant to the final conclusion, to how we read what it is that happened in the 2010s. But first, let me get to the work itself. How did I come to be interested in mass protests? Why did I decide to write about this particular topic? Well, in June 2013, I was living in Sao Paulo, Brazil, working as a foreign correspondent tasked with covering the news in that country, when the topic of mass protests came knocking on my door, quite literally, or another way to put it is that tear gas started to waft up to my apartment. In June 2013, a set of protests originally organized by leftist and anarchist forces exploded after a police crackdown. Now, I was on the streets that day when the police did crack down on the protest. But what happened is that as a result of the police crackdown, Brazil's dominant media, which are often owned by oligarchs, which is the direction that my own country, the United States, has headed, but was not yet there in 2013. Brazil's dominant media in 2013, as a result of this police crackdown, which importantly hit journalists working in Brazil's dominant media, shifted their narrative very quickly. From the morning of June 13th, 2013, when they were saying, we need to clear these punks and anarchists off the streets, we need to return to order, this has got to end. 12 hours later, they were saying, actually, this is a patriotic uprising in defense of the right to rise up patriotically in defense of something. They weren't quite sure exactly what it was about, but dominant media and social media flipped their narrative as to how these protests were being portrayed. As a result, very quickly, new people came into the streets, and these new arrivals in the streets entered into initially verbal but ultimately violent conflict with the original protesters until just 1 week after this change of narrative. Forces that we would now recognize as the beginnings of a far-right movement in Brazil, the people that we would now clearly identify as pre- or proto-Bolsonaristas, the supporters of the extreme right president that took power in 2018, actually physically removed the original leftists from the streets. And some of the groups that were born in this strange cauldron of energy in June 2013 went on to help to elect Jair Bolsonaro in 2018 and to take power alongside with him. And they are now a very dominant force in Brazilian politics. So this protest, which was originally organized by the left, originally had as its demand the lowering of the price of transportation in Brazil, and then as its secondary demand, a revolt against police brutality, somehow indirectly led to, in my eyes, the exact opposite of what had been asked for. On June 13th, 2013, the people, it seemed, went into the streets demanding better public services and less state violence, and then they got a man who very proudly proclaimed that he would destroy state services and that he would kill Brazilians when necessary. So I, like a lot of other people that lived through this strange experience of June 2013, became confounded by this possibility. We could not quite understand how it was that the streets, which had belonged to the left always, as a matter of course, at least since 1968, had been taken over very quickly by the right, and from 2013 to 2018 and until the end of the 2010s, the streets seemed to belong to the right. So as a result, when things like this seemed to begin to be happening in other parts of the world, I and many other people that had lived through this in Brazil would pay attention. So we had Turkey that was happening at the same time as Brazil 2013. We had Ukraine that happened shortly after. We had South Korea a few years later. Every time that something similar seemed to be happening, we would watch, which with a mix of anxiety and trepidation, and ask, is this going to go the same way that things went in Brazil? We hoped that it didn't, and it didn't always go the exact same way. But this led to my own personal involvement, my sort of personal obsession with this question. And then as we got to the end of the decade, it became clear, at least to those people that are capable of counting this kind of thing. I'm not exactly sure how you can count this kind of thing, but those that do came to the conclusion in the 2010s, more people took part in mass protests than at any other point in human history. The 2010s exceeded the previous record of global contention, which had been set in the 1960s. And as Filippo hinted at, if you looked at what happened, not only in the Brazilian case, but a few years later, in many cases, what had been the long-term results of these explosions around the world, the outcomes were varied at best. Another way to put it is that many of them were catastrophic. Many of them ended up being experienced as failures by the people that put together protests in the first place. So what I decided to do with this particular experience and this particular obsession was to try to tell the story of the 2010s globally. And like any global history, this must be and was constructed around a certain set of concerns and a certain question, right? So you cannot, of course, actually tell the story of the world from 2010 to 2020. So I told this story as if the most important thing to happen in the 2010s is the mass protest that got so big that it became something else. I acted as if this was the central dynamic of the 2010s, and I think it might as well have been. If you're going to construct a history of that decade around something, it might as well have been this. And it was constructed around a question, as history always is. Histories are always written with particular motivations and values that are important to the writer and the readers in the present. I built it around the question of how is it possible that so many mass protests led to the opposite of what they had apparently asked for. Now, as Filippo indicated, the method for carrying out this interview was this project was the interview. I'm a journalist. I went to 12 countries and spoke to 250 people, asking them what happened, what is it that you were asking for, what did you get? If it wasn't what you were asking for, why not? And how would you have done things differently if you could go back and do them again? And so very quickly, the episodes that we cover in the book, just to have a refresh of the decade that we're talking about here. It's Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Syria, Yemen, Turkey, Brazil, Ukraine, Hong Kong, Indonesia, South Korea, Hong Kong again, and Chile. And not all of these cases are devastating failures, but a lot of them are. And this was what really drove the investigation. Now, building a book like this around interviews means particular strengths and particular weaknesses. In mass protests like this, I'll start with the strength, it becomes clear that in these kinds of moments of revolutionary possibility, in moments where decades seem to be happening, decisions that are made in an instant tend to matter much more than they do in other parts in history. So while I tend to, as a journalist and a writer, favor long-term structural explanations for change in society, in mass protests, somebody looking back on the moment they got to a corner and decided to go left rather than right, how it felt being in that moment are an important part of the story. And then the weakness is that they're limited to what they lived through and what they saw. They are limited to the things that they conceived of as possible at the time and the other organizational forms that were present. It's very difficult for somebody recounting their experiences on the streets of Cairo to discuss the ways that shifts in the world system made their particular society more or less vulnerable to radical change at a given time. And I accept as a premise, and I'm not the only one, I use a particular phrase for this, but I accept, like many other researchers, scholars, journalists, that there is, in the global system in the 2010s, a crisis of representation. That all of these protests, somehow or another, are related to a crisis of representation in the global system. And as I say, there's not a lot of disagreement here. If you ask people, if you ask citizens, do the people that represent you or that are supposed to be representing you properly represent you? Empirically, we know that people no longer think that that's the case. And if you look at social scientists, even, we don't have to be looking at radical scholars to come to this conclusion. If we ask political scientists, who it is that the contemporary state tends to represent primarily is business interests rather than the common citizen. This is not really controversial. So I do believe that in each individual case, we have many more than one issues at play, but the crisis of representation is a fundamental framework for understanding this decade. Now, the answer to that question, how is it possible that so many mass protests led to the opposite of what they apparently asked for, I believe is the story itself. I think that it can't really be answered any way other than the narrative that is constructed. That's why I decided to build this book in this way. Each case really is different, and it is one of the major mistakes that was made by people in my class, people in the mainstream media in the English language at the time, was to interpret things as if they were the same just because images on a screen looked similar. But it would be very cheap and easy just to say, well, then the answer is to read the book. In a talk like this, what I can do is speak about a framework that emerges through this particular investigation that helped me to understand how it was in each individual case that the original organizers might have experienced the outcome as either success, failure, or disaster. So that framework is, in the 2010s, a particular form of resistance, a particular way that human beings can respond to injustice or to perceived abuses committed by the state or by elites became hegemonic, often appearing even to be the only or the natural way to respond to injustice. And in the 2010s, my view is that that form, that repertoire of contention in the sociological language, that recipe of tactics is the apparently spontaneous, leaderless, digitally coordinated, horizontally structured mass protest in a public square or a public space. Now, as my brief introduction about Regine Wallerstein would have indicated, this is not the only way to try to transform the global system. All of these elements come from somewhere. They all have a material and ideological prehistory. Of course, digital coordination comes about as the result of the particular type of for-profit social media firms that become widely available in the 2010s. In other parts of the recipe, I think, have to do with pre-existing ideological elements that were held by perhaps a minority of people, but found elective affinity for what was possible in the 2010s. There's a famous quote from Kwame Ture, who was in the Black Panther Party in the United States, where he makes a distinction between mobilization and organization. And I think the 2010s is a decade in which mobilization becomes easier than ever and organization becomes more difficult than ever. But what happens with this particular recipe of tactics, this particular approach to transforming a national or world system, is not failure. It doesn't just not work. Because in the history of protest, it is very familiar to hear of stories that just go nowhere. A lot of people get together and make a point and nothing happens. That's not what happens in the 2010s. What happens is that this particular recipe is extremely effective at generating quantitative increases of humanity on the streets. It is incredibly effective at getting huge amounts of people into squares, into plazas, and getting so many people into the streets that real opportunities are created. Either governments are overthrown, and the most dramatic examples of this are when a dictator has to jump on a plane and flee the country, or in less dramatic cases, existing elites realize that things cannot go on as before, and they are frantic to come up with some kind of a solution. They try to negotiate, they try to come to the streets and say, what do you want? Because I know that in order to hold on to power, I must give you something. Now, what happens over and over, tragically, in what I call the mass decade in English, or the years of revolt without revolution in Italian, is that these real opportunities are created. But in zero of the cases that I look at, is it the actual protest? Is it the actual street movement? Is the actual revolt that is able to take advantage of them? There are real opportunities every single time, in every case at least that I choose to analyze in the book, and always somebody does take advantage. In zero of those cases is it the actual revolt. It turns out that this particular form, this particular organizational repertoire and tactical repertoire that was so effective at creating unexpected opportunities. A protest, and specifically a protest of this type, digitally coordinated, horizontally structured, cannot fill a power vacuum when the dictator jumps on a plane and flies to Saudi Arabia. And often in the less pronounced cases, cannot even communicate to existing elites what it is that they will accept or what it is that the revolt will accept, so that the existing ruler can believe that things will go back to normal if that concession is granted. How are we doing on time? Okay. Fantastic. So to make a very crude analogy with sort of the classic organizational forms that we might remember from the 20th century, sometimes I like to think of what would have happened if Fidel Castro and Che Guevara fought a guerrilla war in the mountains of Cuba, succeeded in overthrowing the Batista regime, but the Batista regime flees the country, but then Che Guevara and Fidel Castro are either unwilling or unable to form a new government. What would have happened in that case if they would have said, okay, our job is done, or if they were turned out that they could not form a new government? Probably what would have happened is that economic elites in Cuba would have gotten together with the remnants of the military and probably the United States government and patched together something that was kind of the same, but with a different name, right? Whether or not we like that Che and Fidel established their new government, they certainly had the idea that they were going to, and they immediately acted to try to do so. And in a less pronounced case, where there is not an actual power vacuum, a dictator fleeing, but there is a government that is, and this is the case in Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, who's the president of Brazil at the time in 2013, who came from the left, who had been tortured during the dictatorship. She did come to the streets to say, okay, what is it that you want? Another crude analogy to old organizational forms would have been if a strike shuts down a factory, the owner of the factory says, okay, what do you want? And then the striking workers do not come up with any set of demands. They do not allow the owner of the factory to believe that if he or she usually historically gives in to this demand, he will get his factory going back and producing more products. And in that case, the factory owner has no incentive to give in to any demands and usually will opt for either repression or wait until the workers cannot feed themselves. And this is often what happens in the less pronounced cases. Rulers either wait for energy to dissolve or simply repress the movement on the streets. Now, after my book came out, a Ukrainian sociologist, Volodymyr Ishchenko, he published a book where he puts this very succinctly in one sentence because he analyzes what he calls the type of protest that he associates with the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine or the color revolutions in the former Second World in the 2000s. And he says that the motivations of the rank and file are a very poor indicator of the final outcomes of these types of revolt. And what I found, at least looking at cases that got big enough to overthrow governments or to fundamentally destabilize existing governments, there was essentially no correlation whatsoever between the reasons for the original revolt and what the people got as a result. It all had to do with who was it that took advantage of the opportunities. Now, in the cases where enemies of the original protesters, enemies of the original movement are the people that take advantage of the opportunity, that is experienced as defeat, as tragedy. And in some cases, when people that are more or less allies of the people on the streets, who come from more or less the same tradition, who have more or less the same goals, or at least understand what they're asking for, this is the case in Chile or the case in South Korea, then the revolts, the final outcome of the revolt is experienced as a relative or a moderate success. So, and the way the language that Ishchenko uses for this, and he also accepts that he uses Gramsci, that these revolts are responding to a real crisis of hegemony in this former Second World in particular, but in the global system in general. And he says that these revolts respond to a real crisis of hegemony, but end up reinforcing the very dynamics that they seek to overturn. So if we go back to that original formulation of the anti-systemic movements, a conclusion that I come to is that this very particular form, on its own, the apparently spontaneous, leaderless, digitally coordinated, horizontally structured mass protest, on its own, while it may be anti-systemic subjectively, is objectively pro-systemic. That despite the motivations, the beliefs that might get people to take part in this particular form, the long-term outcome can be pro-systemic in that it simply opens opportunity for whatever pre-existing pre-existing forces exist in a given society or a given region to enter a vacuum and to reinforce their power. And many cases that, we get to the final point and get to try to relate this to the theme of war and peace. In many cases, what we saw in the 2010s is foreign intervention, because either the biggest guy in the neighborhood or the biggest guy in the world system, would be in the United States, perceived an opportunity that could be exploited by launching an invasion or some kind of an imperialist counterattack. And in other cases, there were local economic elites, reactionary forces, or whoever was organized in civil society that were able to take advantage of these given opportunities. So I said that I asked my interviewees several questions, not only what happened, what did you get, what did you believe, why do you believe things went the way that they did? I also asked them what they would have done differently if they had the chance to run things over. And because we have not seen, as far as I can tell, in the 2010s, a truly new form of anti-systemic movement, because it was the case that the groups that tended to win out were some kind of remnant of a pre-existing historical form of anti-systemic movement, my interviewees often pointed to the Union, a revolutionary party, something like a more Leninist or a more well-structured organizational form, or a social movement. These things that had existed before the 2010s and that some people thought could be skipped because of the possibilities of the internet. So probably the most common answer that I heard to that question, what would you have done differently? What advice would you give to a new generation of protesters or people that want to change a national system? Is to organize beforehand, to organize when it appears that nothing is happening. Because in almost every case that came up in the book, the explosion on the streets took place much more quickly and to a larger scale than anybody had anticipated. But again, saying to organize and to look to the pre-existing organizational form doesn't solve the question of how to create them in the 2010s or the 2020s in this moment of such danger for not only a utopian transformative project, but just to hold on to what we still have from 20th century democracy. Of course, I'm from the United States. We've seen in the last few weeks. Certainly, I did not expect an attack with this ferocity and with this much determination on the remaining institutions and the remaining civil society that we have in the United States. So turning to those historical forms was the best that we could come up with, at least my interviewees. And going back to the original case of Brazil, it may be the case that when what is really needed is defense, the remnants of those historical forms can be called upon to hold you through a period of aggressive reaction. When Bolsonaro did try to crush Brazilian democracy, and he really did try, when he was associated with a movement that attempted to assassinate or imprison and then assassinate former President Lula, the groups that were able to hold on somehow to democracy were old unions that were 40 years old, social movements that were 40 years old, and the Workers' Party that was just barely not destroyed by right-wing reaction. So that the power of defense that is latent in even degraded or forms of organization that are less powerful than they would have been in the 20th century is something that emerges once finally from the long-term consequences of the Brazilian case. And then I'll return, before I finish up, I hope this was the right amount of time, to that theme of war and peace. The two gaping wounds, I think, in the geopolitical situation right now, the war that is happening in Europe and the horrific tragedy unfolding since October in Palestine, are both related to the unresolved revolts in this book. I think that the war in Ukraine starts as a result of the response to the 2013 Ukrainian Maidan uprising, that the the long-term consequences of that uprising have not been resolved, and the war is the response to that lack of resolution. And certainly what is happening to the people of Palestine is related to the resolution that was forced upon the Arab Spring, specifically in Egypt, when Gulf states and then ultimately the Obama administration got together behind the 2013 counter-revolutionary military coup that would install Sisi and maintain what was perceived as geopolitical stability for the actors in the United States. So whether or not my interviewees were able to come up with all the answers for the future, I do believe that understanding the strange events of this decade are essential to understanding what is happening at this very moment. Thank you very much.
Bene, molte grazie. Abbiamo una ventina di minuti per discutere, quindi io chiederei anzitutto se ci sono domande, interventi, commenti, curiosità, sia sul metodo che sui contenuti che sulle conclusioni. Siamo padroni del tempo e dello spazio, quindi possiamo farlo. Se c'è qualcuno, c'è un microfono, altrimenti qualcuno che vuole intervenire? Tanto che scaldiamo un po'. Allora, scaldo un po' io, rompo il ghiaccio io con un paio di questioni, intanto che arrivano le altre domande. Allora, la prima è questa. C'è una bellissima frase nel libro, credo, se non ricordo male, detta da un attivista brasiliano, che è: il potere non ammette vuoti. Il potere non ammette vuoti. Quindi è molto bella questa frase, perché il succo, avete sentito, no? Il succo dell'argomentazione è un po' questa. Le rivolte creano un vuoto di potere, ma il potere non ammette vuoti. Qualcuno lo riempie quel potere, o da dentro o da fuori. Quindi i movimenti di protesta che non sono strutturalmente organizzati per prendere il potere, o non sono interessati a prendere il potere. Ecco, due cose, no? Ecco, diciamo così. È un problema di organizzazione, le motivazioni per farlo ci sarebbero, oppure no. Il potere non è un oggetto di interesse per questi movimenti. In un modo o nell'altro l'esito è che appunto il vuoto di potere viene riempito da qualcuno, o dall'esterno o dall'interno. Questo è un po' il meccanismo chiave di tutta l'argomentazione, e su questo volevo magari qualche commento. La seconda cosa è che per uscire, è stata un po' la conclusione del suo discorso, no? Per uscire da questo equilibrio subottimale, diciamo così, è necessaria l'organizzazione. È necessario rimettere al centro dell'argomentazione, insomma, il tema dell'organizzazione politica. Quindi non solo la mobilitazione, ma anche il tema dell'intermediazione organizzata, che il repertorio dei movimenti che ci ha descritto non aveva al proprio centro, perché aveva assorbito un repertorio orizontalista, spontaneista, leaderless, come è stato detto, che rifiutava questo tipo di momento organizzativo. Allora, la domanda è: se il tema è questo, quello della ricostruzione di una forma organizzata dell'intermediazione politica, qual è questa forma in una società che non è più quella novecentesca? Perché la società è cambiata moltissimo. Quindi qual è la forma, o ci puoi dare qualche indicazione, o gli attivisti che hai intervistato ti hanno dato qualche indicazione per immaginare una nuova forma della politica? Tra gli attivisti c'è anche questo Rodrigo Núñez, no? Che ha scritto un libro che si intitola Né verticale né orizzontale, che è proprio su questo tema. E lui dà qualche indicazione, però volevo sentire soprattutto Vincent Bevins su questo. E poi se ci puoi dire qualcosa in più sui casi devianti, diciamo così, che hai citato brevemente, che sono il Cile, sui casi in cui qualcosa è successo, e se questi casi, diciamo così, devianti rispetto al pattern principale confermano il pattern principale, cioè se nel caso cileno e nel caso sudcoreano effettivamente un raccordo tra il movimento e l'organizzazione politica c'è stato, come effettivamente mi pare di poter dire, però se su questo puoi elaborare un po' di più. Ecco, puoi magari fare un secondo intervento su queste cose. Grazie. E poi se ci sono domande, c'è qualche domanda? Sì, c'era il signore, mi scusi, non l'avevo vista, prego.
Ci sono due punti di riferimento. Uno, quando lei parlava delle organizzazioni storiche, e una di quelle che in Italia c'è stato la manifestazione della CGIL a Roma, se vi ricordate, Cofferati, segretario generale della CGIL, che dopo quel periodo ci sono state una serie di batoste a livello del settore operaio e quindi di arretramento dei diritti all'interno della società e delle fabbriche. L'altro punto di riferimento quindi era un'organizzazione esistente, la CGIL. L'altro è il movimento che c'è stato dei G8 a Genova, che veniva appunto dal Brasile, tutto quel movimento, che anche lì allora un movimento spontaneo, molto organizzato come partecipazione e via dicendo, ma tutti e due con due sconfitte uno dopo l'altro. Terza domanda. La manifestazione che c'è stata ultima a Roma, convocata da Serra, a mio avviso va in quella direzione, cioè nel senso che darà diciamo, al gruppo dirigente dell'Unione Europea di una massima accentuazione negli armamenti e nello sfocio comunque di una guerra. Perché anche lì c'è il seme di una parvenza di organizzazione, ma non c'è un'organizzazione che va a modificare quella parte lì e vincerà quella parte militare all'interno della guerra, all'interno del nostro paese.
I got the second and third. What's the first question? How would you? Mm. Right. Okay. Should I answer these?
Yeah. Okay.
Go these. Should I do you and then him? Okay.
As you wish.
Okay. I understood like 95% of what you said and 85% whatever you said. So I'll start here. Yes, this phrase that you brought up came not only from a Brazilian activist that had gone sort of faced off against the government of Brazil, but the actual person on the other side of the conflict. It was both parties, the left wing, so the Workers' Party that came out of the trade union movement in Brazil, and I'm going to try to connect it to the second part of your question. The group that started they're called the Movimento Passe Livre. The group that started the protest in 2013, the group of leftists and anarchists had traced their organizational roots very directly to the alter globalization movement of the early 2000s. So they had all worked for Indie Media Brazil. They had been participating in protests against multinational organizations going back to the early 2000s. Seattle was the big case in the United States. Geneva, of course, was the case here. And those organizational forms were brought into the 2010s, and then, as I said, found elective affinity with the internet. I mean, there was very few people that believed. The group in Brazil were, in a very deep sense, horizontalist. They really believed that this was the right way to carry out politics, that there should be absolutely no structure, there should be absolutely no hierarchy. But there weren't that many people in the 2010s that believed this as deeply as them. And this is why it was important what you said, that in some cases the movements were organizationally simply incapable of trying to change, take power or effect power, and in other cases they were ideologically opposed to this. So one of the big things about the alter globalization movement is that after one apparent success, they did shut down one big meeting, I think it was the IMF or the WTO. They kept repeating the same tactic, trying to do it again, and it became known as summit hopping. Right? And they were still, these people were still going to meet and decide the rules of the global economy, even if you could get them from entering the building for a few days. And this kind of a dynamic, I think, is repeated in the 2010s, but at a much quicker pace. What I think that social media does is it doesn't change fundamentally the structures of power in any given society, as much as many of us wanted to believe back in 2011 that they were changing all of the rules of politics. They changed the speed at which sympathetic words, images, videos can be reproduced from one part of the world to another. And this is something that we absolutely saw in the 2010s. I call it the mass protest decade in English, but it could really be called the Tahrir decade. After the apparent success of 2011 in Egypt, you see a sort of copying and pasting of a tactic that was apparently successful in one country to many other parts of the world. Occupy Wall Street in the United States was an attempt to do Tahrir in New York. And then even after it becomes clear that the Egypt rebellion does not succeed or that it is crushed by counter-revolution, the students in Hong Kong are still trying to do the Tahrir model, which, they're trying to copy Occupy Wall Street, which was a copy of Tahrir Square, which was inspired by Tunisia in the first place. So the point that you make, if I understand correctly, about the lack of an organized force that could take advantage of another crisis or opportunity, I think is one that is tragically just simply true. I don't know how to respond to it. What was the substance of the third? I understand the issue about the debate of European rearmament. What was the substance of the question?
There were journalists
Mhm.
called
Mhm. 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 Okay. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, so I think that the answer to that is roughly the same. If there is indeed no organization that is capable of taking advantage of a given opportunity like this, there's two, I guess, possible conclusions. Do not bet on destabilization and hope that something good will come out of it, especially moments of extreme danger and moments where the defense of democracy is paramount, or accept, and this is a lesson that many of my interviewees try to pass on, that you can't stop that kind of a thing from happening even if you want. Like the crisis, the opportunity will come whether or not you are expecting it. So the best you can do is to get together with people and do the best to create the forms that can be reactive to the unexpected. You want to go? Should we take another question, or I can discuss the South Korean and the Chilean cases? Is there a question?
Allora, io ho letto un libro che trattava di quello che quando c'era stato Obama ehm, ehm, a governare, ehm, avevano avevano messo molti fondi per alimentare nella zona del Maghreb, non solo, ehm, lo scambio di informazioni tra i giovani, cioè alimentando la comunicazione via web. Questo era stato un po' diciamo la base per quello che era stata poi la primavera, che era poi sfociata nelle rivolte nel Nord Africa. Però la conclusione di questo libro era che, ehm la gente e soprattutto i giovani si erano mossi comunicando via web, con tutte le varie possibilità, però poi quando c'è stato è stato il momento di entrare in azione, diciamo così, le rivolte son state poi prese da strutture che c'erano già esistenti, e quindi la rivolta, che comunque era sul web, era aveva molto seguito. Poi quando è stato il momento di metterla in opera, tipo in Egitto, ad esempio, è stata poi presa adesso non mi ricordo chi era il gruppo che c'era presente al momento, però comunque la rivolta dei giovani poi è svanita sostanzialmente. Quindi considerato che al momento comunque questo è quello del web è un supporto, no, che serve per comunicare, per organizzarsi, eccetera. Come si può sopperire poi alla mancanza di poi messa in opera, no, di quella che sono le istanze, no?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a part of the book that is fundamental, but I didn't really get to in the talk. So thank you for the question. It allows me to get to a couple of different things via your experience reading another book. So my first book, The Jakarta Method, is about the construction of a global imperialist capitalist system with the United States as its hegemonic power. In every one of the cases in this book, in If We Burn or say Noi Bruciamo, there is the relationship between the revolt on the streets and that global system matters. Now, in most of the cases, that relationship becomes most important in the final stage. That relationship becomes important in the imposition of some kind of an outcome. In Libya, a place where Hillary Clinton and the Secretary of State under Obama really wanted some kind of a revolt to allow her to push North Africa in a pro-Western direction, took advantage of a small amount of legitimate protests against Gaddafi to essentially launch a NATO regime change operation to bomb and destroy the country. And so that's a very clear example of the relationship to the imperialist system mattering at the end of the revolt. In other cases, some kind of relationship existed with that system at the beginning of the revolt. So in Ukraine, for example, they are the people that organized the first protests in November of 2013. They legitimately believed in a pro-Western path for Ukraine. They weren't like secret agents, but they all were funded essentially. The people that came out in the first day of the Maidan uprising were essentially all funded by NGOs that got their financing from the West. George Soros, again, not saying that in a conspiratorial way, that's fine. We talked about what that meant and the decisions that they made to take money from the West or from USAID. That really affected the beginning of the outcome in Ukraine. That's one case where at the beginning that relationship matters quite a lot. Now in Egypt, which I think might be the case that you were referring to, one of the many groups that organized the January 25th protest, the April 6th movement, had gotten a small amount of funds from Freedom House. And they had one video call with Serbian activists from Otpor that had carried out an uprising in the Gene Sharp sort of pro-liberal tradition a decade prior. And the United States, starting in the middle of the 2000s, around 2005, had started investing in the project of using the internet to liberalize the global system. And again, this is kind of something that everybody believed. Everybody, left, liberal, right, or conservative, all sort of believed that the internet was going to make the world more free, more democratic, more transparent. And the United States absolutely was investing in projects to train some parts of the North African youth in using digital tools to democratize. But when Tunisia happens, and at the very beginning, it is people that are absolutely not linked with the US government. There's a Marxist-Leninist party deep in Tunisia, and there's a set of protests in the interior of that country. And then when Egypt explodes, it really takes the United States by surprise. A lot of people in the United States government don't know how to respond. They can't figure out what to do. But there was this deep belief, and I think Hillary Clinton is one of the sort of the deepest believers in it, and this sort of Fukuyaman thesis that everything's just kind of going to become America. Like, if you just knock over something bad, something will grow in its place, and it'll just be kind of like a junior version of the United States. And I think this is a deep ideological assumption in the United States ruling class, and it was especially strong at the beginning of the 2010s. And I think the Libya invasion grows out of this. As I said, NATO takes advantage of this uprising. A small amount of protests against Gaddafi to launch a regime change operation. And then there's another deal that is made behind the scenes where Saudi Arabia wants to crush an uprising in Bahrain, and a deal is apparently made where the United States very much wants to maintain its military base in Bahrain. So geopolitics always, another thing that I didn't get to in the original talk is that in the history of revolts and revolutions, the geopoliticization of the conflict is very familiar, right? It happened after the French Revolution, happened after the Bolshevik Revolution, happened after 1959. When there is a revolution, there is usually a counter-revolution. Often, allies of the old regime invade, attack. There is usually some kind of a violent attempt to win back power. And one of the things that this particular form of revolt in the 2010s was not capable of doing, in addition to filling a power vacuum, was to fight back against these counter-revolutionary attacks. So if you might call it, the decade of revolts without a revolution, you could also call it a decade of counter-revolutions without revolutions, where you have the geopolitization of conflict, you have a violent counterattack against a movement which is not actually even a revolution. It simply provides the pretext for counter-revolutionary action. Now, that's a long answer. Before I got to your actual real question, what to do about the internet, I think, is a fundamental question, because if 2011 was sort of the high point of techno-optimism, the point at which everybody believed the internet would be good for everything, the last 6 months have been in 2015, more or less 2016, people started to realize there was something wrong with the internet, something wrong with social media. By 2020, 2021, there are very vocal criticisms of an internet which is essentially owned by a set of oligarchs in my home state of California. In the last 6 months, we see these oligarchs coming out and saying, yes, I'm an oligarch. Yes, I'm using the internet to push right-wing agenda. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to crush democracy. I'm proud of it. I dare you. I think it was like yesterday morning or in the Financial Times that the European Union backed off of its attempts to regulate Meta and Google because they were afraid that Donald Trump would retaliate. So unfortunately, we are in the era of the geopoliticization, not only of revolt, but of the internet itself. And the question of how to win the internet back from these oligarchs that live in my home state of California, I think is another fundamental one that I don't have the answer to.
Ok, grazie. Allora, abbiamo ancora qualche minuto. Chiederei, se non ci sono domande, però abbiamo ancora 5-10 minuti anche volendo, per cui se ci sono le raccogliamo. Prego, sì, grazie. C'è una signora là in alto.
La tipologia del pacifismo, ok? Lei in che relazione li mette con le proteste di massa e su quello che lei ha detto? Hanno dinamiche similari oppure no? E ovviamente le azioni pacifiste hanno una loro fisionomia, ok? Però a mio parere ora, in questi ultimi decenni, non hanno portato a niente, o meglio sfioriscono, appassiscono e non producono. Quindi c'è una relazione. Possiamo mettergli anche movimenti pacifisti dentro queste proteste di massa di cui lei ha detto? Grazie.
Grazie. C'è ancora una domanda? Sì, ne raccogliamo ancora una seconda, così risponde a entrambe. Grazie.
Io mi chiedevo, mi sembra ci sia una sorta di contraddizione nel fatto di, o meglio una contraddizione, una frattura abbastanza insanabile in questo tipo di proteste e nel tentativo di farle riuscire, che mi sembra sia nel fatto che in questo momento il potere è sicuramente molto concentrato e l'unico modo per creare un vuoto di potere è inevitabilmente avere un movimento di massa. dove però un movimento di massa è inevitabilmente contraddittorio al suo interno. E quindi trovo difficile capire come possa avere una guida unica che funzioni appunto dando una direzione precisa e organizzativa al movimento. Quindi da una parte per creare il vuoto serve la massa, ma la massa inevitabilmente non ha potere, e quindi la conseguenza è che qualcun altro che ha già il potere si approfitterà di questa cosa. Non so, mi chiedevo se c'è un modo per risolvere questo.
Mm-hmm.
Sì.
Bene, grazie. Prego, Vincent.
I do those too. Those are both great questions. The first question, again, allows me to connect a bunch of things that I would have liked to say anyways. Hopefully I'm going to try to connect it to the theme and to a previous question. David Graeber, anarchist anthropologist from the United States and a major figure in the anti-globalization movement back in the era of Seattle and Geneva. He published an essay in New Left Review called The New Anarchists. And a point that he made was, well, the Cold War is over, which he makes the logical jump to war is over, which turns out not to be true, but it made sense at the time. The Cold War is over. We all know that anarchist forms of organization do very poorly in a war. But because war is over, we can bring them back, right? And it turned out, and this is, it starts to anticipate your question, it turns out that they were really effective at bringing together people in a society which is concretely disorganized, atomized, neoliberalized, individualized, where people are not certainly in the United States, it's worse than any other country in the world, and I believe in Western Europe, it's worse than it was in the 70s or the 30s. The atomization was such that this particular form managed to have some success. It got huge amounts of people in the streets. But what happened, and what happens always in the history of revolts, is that if you start to succeed, someone declares war on you. And whether or not that war is outright invasion, tanks on the ground, or political war, economic war, that is what happened over and over in the 2010s. And this is that's the sort of, that is the old that's the old classic capital L left response to nonviolence and in protest, that it absolutely works as long as your enemies aren't willing to use violence to stop you. And in certain cases, the new social movements that emerged after 1968, I think were successful at pushing a lot of causes that I think were incredibly important. I think a lot of victories were scored in the post-1968 era in the realms of gender, sexuality, identity. But these were all things that could be achieved because elites did not feel the need, did not feel so threatened that they were willing to start a war to kill hundreds of thousands of people to stop, for example, gay marriage in California. And when you get to really big questions, I think there does tend to be a war. Now, that contradiction that the second question brought up, I think is very real. One reaction to the book that I wasn't quite expecting was that, we can just do the exact same thing, but not horizontal. Well, that horizontality, that often the lack of explicit ideology behind the mass protests is what I think in many cases allowed them to scale up so quickly in the first place, right? If you had, for example, in Egypt, if it was clear from the beginning that there was a well-organized, well-structured movement with a clear ideology to transform Egypt in a left social democratic fashion, you wouldn't have got the world's media showing up to shower it with praise. You wouldn't have got quite as many people on the streets, and it wouldn't have been able to take off in the way that it did. So somehow or another, the scorched earth of the scorched earth on the organizational front is a fact that must be dealt with, and it makes certain revolts possible, and it makes certain types of revolts more likely to scale it very quickly. The problem is, exactly as you point out, if that is the only one that is available, it is also the one that cannot take advantage of the possibilities, the opportunities that it creates. So I absolutely take this point. I think you're right to call it a contradiction, a fracture. And again, there's a couple ways to go about a possible response. Rodrigo Nunes it's right in the book. He tries for a sort of a dialectical resolution of the conflict between horizontality and verticality. And other people just simply go back to an era before the rejection of organization. In Brazil, I didn't speak about this so much, but I'm only thinking about it now because I have a big story coming out on this next week. One of the major social movements in Brazil that played a huge part in the defense of democracy is the landless workers movement, the MST. And they do not have a single leader. They do not have, like, the man. They have a collective leadership, and they have a very, very large and in some ways decentralized bureaucracy, but it is a bureaucracy that does two things. It allows for a collective leadership, but it also, I mean, this is something that is very difficult to reproduce elsewhere, but I'll still point to it anyways. It gives working class people a reason to be involved immediately. There's not only the promise of a long-term transformative project that you can maybe one day carry out a revolution, but if you're a working class Brazilian and you join the landless workers movement, tomorrow you'll have a place to live and an income. And so they would say that they operate through a combination of democratic centralism and decentralization. But I think the real magic combination there is to give real benefits to working class people in the short term while also offering long-term transformative possibilities.
Bene, un po' di speranza. Bene, grazie. Allora possiamo chiudere. Grazie ancora a voi e grazie a Vincent. Grazie. Vi ricordo che il libro è in vendita qui fuori sulla destra. Vincent è disponibile per un firmacopie. È un libro assolutamente da leggere. Vincent è qui, quindi approfittatene. Grazie ancora.